I've always been the kind of person who tends to like the villain more than the hero, and try my best to understand them, and it's always great to see how different writers like to create their own Davers of Destruction. And I mean, obviously most writers create different types of villains in their own respective stories, but even if they are conceptually different, you can usually see a pattern or trend between these characters. For a series like One Piece, which focuses so heavily on its main cast, you might expect Oda to de-emphasize the importance of villains in his story, but it's actually quite the opposite. As we'll get into it, you'll begin to see how Oda creates his villains as essentially the canvases for each arc of his story, and although he might paint on top of them, they still remain at the core, giving the entire arc its shape and form. By the way, this video isn't me invalidating any other mangakas, or even saying Oda is the best at writing villains. In fact, if you guys want me to, I can do this thing for other writers instead of just Oda. Anyway, let's jump into this because I want this to be a shorter kind of video. When making notes for this video, I was just kind of sorting through all the villains into specific categories and highlighting what their effect on the story is, but I couldn't find those qualities that just screamed One Piece. Like, yes, Oda likes to give characters motivations, usually related to their backstory or character in such a way that makes it realistic or understandable, but does he do it exceptionally? Does the phrase villain motivation really speak One Piece to you? So I kept at it, and eventually I got 2 or maybe 2.5 if you want to look at it that way, elements for me that I at least personally think Oda hits perfectly. The first one being an introduction through observation. For an example of what I mean, let's look at Doflamingo. When we enter Dressrosa, it may seem like a pretty great place at first, but as we get deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole, we start to see how terrible it truly is. Not only was it taken over forcefully, with the king being forced to murder his own subjects, but the entire country is basically funded by a slave ring of its own citizens who are turned into fucking toys. And all this time, Doflamingo is not really present. He's more a distant figure the crew is working up towards. It's only after we see all he has done that we start going into his backstory and why he performs his evil deeds. This is a very prevalent structure in One Piece, and I think its purpose is rooted deeply into one of the story's central themes, that being power and corruption. When we look at the list of characters who Oda treats this way, we see the underlying factor between them all. They all have some kind of political power, whether it comes from royalty, military authority, or simply a badge that allies you with the Marines. They all hold some kind of power and even ally themselves with the world government. The big exception to this rule obviously being Enel, who is actually the most important out of all of them, but we'll get into that later. Oda loves to focus on the population of each island we visit, with each one having their own personality and struggles. Water 7 holds kind-hearted people who are loyal to their mayor. Alabaster citizens are all politically split to the point of ignorance, neither willing to listen to any other side, while Dressrosa citizens are kind of pieces of shit if I'm being honest, but that's only because of Doflamingo's manipulation over the island, which is the point I'm trying to make. By seeing the effect the villain has on the people, we draw our own conclusion about said villain before we even get a detailed look into their character, which is great because it allows Oda to either completely deliver on what he promised or instead subvert our expectations with some kind of tragic backstory. Doflamingo is literally a character that pulls strings to get what he wants. Crocodile's greed literally sucked the hope out of a country. Big Mom's flawed wonderland comes from her mother's wish for equality. It's effectively a narrative juxtaposition. We begin with focusing on the effect on the island, showing the more human side, and portraying the villain as some heartless menace, and in the second half flip it and instead focus on the villain, showing their human side and fleshing out the character much more. Next would be something I kind of teased before, that being a villain's role in the story of One Piece, that being an introduction to the world. Now, the obvious example for this would be all the corruption that takes place, with one of the central messages of the series being the fluidity of justice, and that just because you have authority doesn't mean you have any moral standing. The biggest one being Enel, who is the first instance in One Piece of this idea of false gods, which is important because that's effectively what the entire political system is built on. The Celestial Dragons, who rule the world as gods despite being made of nothing but flesh. Yet here Enel is, a being made of pure fucking lightning, and even he gets humbled by a 17-year-old boy who stretches real good. And in the same way Luffy tore down Enel from his post, his father, Monkey D. Dragon, aims to do the same with the Celestial Dragons. Oda uses Enel as a way to introduce us to the idea of false gods in this world, and he does it with countless of other villains. Akainu is the perfect embodiment of the Marines and everything wrong with it, while Smoker is the audience's look into the individuals that make up the organization, and how morality isn't always black and white. In fact, Smoker is at first shown to believe all pirates are evil, but slowly figures out over time that not only are some pirates morally rich, but also that the institution he pledged his whole life to can sometimes be more morally questionable than actual criminals. He's the perfect perspective when being introduced to the Marines, and in the same way, Akanu's absolute justice parallels this perfectly, with him acting as effectively the perfect soldier in any situation, and even killing his own men if they choose to desert the Marines. On the other hand, we also have an introduction to the criminal side of the world, especially in the East Blue Saga, with Arlong basically acting as the final boss before they enter the Grand Line. These early villains are proof that just because Luffy is a nice guy doesn't mean all pirates are going to be as chill as him or Shanks, and that there's actually a reason that they are genuinely hated and outlawed by the average man. Speaking of pirates though, you have characters like Katakuri who, despite not really representing any ideologies, was our introduction to the next level of pirates, something that Luffy hadn't reached at that point. He posed an obstacle that Luffy had to overcome if he realistically wanted to become the king of the pirates. The man with a million berry bounty, part of the upper echelon of pirates. In my opinion at least, he was necessary for us to properly understand the stakes of the Wano arc, given how many commanders are in this fucking arc, and even if his bounty has basically been shit on by everyone, he's still the arbiter of the absolute beast we're seeing our main cast clash with. To put it plainly, Katakuri acts as the context for the rest of the commanders, as he is clearly one of the more exceptional. We can use him as a scale for a character that Luffy is stronger than, weaker than, or roughly on the same level. Either way, Oda uses his villains, including Katakuri, as reflections of the world around them, as the forces that act on the average man, and are one of the many reasons One Piece world building is probably so glorified in the anime community. Which I guess is why those were the traits that jumped out to me, because One Piece is such a vast world, and the villains help to realize said world. These traits end up becoming linked to Oda's identity as a writer. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this, I don't know, short little video just as an insight into Oda's writing. Given that I have quite a few new subscribers now, I might make another proper JoJo video, given that it's been a while, so I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, video's over.